The 2022 NBA trade deadline quickly became one of the most active deadlines we'd seen in years. So I'm going to go through and grade the 5 biggest moves of the 2022 NBA trade deadline. Thank you for clicking on the video, by the way. I really appreciate it. We begin, of course, with the big move. I did a whole video on this yesterday if you want the full complete breakdown, but I didn't go as far as to grade the James Harden Ben Simmons trade. If you watched that video, if you just saw the title of that video, you probably know that I think it was a pretty big win-win for both sides. And really, it's just going to come down to what happens into the future. I don't think that this is a trade that you can grade super negatively for either team in this moment. It's just going to come down to all the question marks around these teams and how they get answered. How does Ben Simmons fit alongside Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving? Does Kyrie Irving become a full-time player at any point for the Nets this season? How does it impact their postseason contention? Is Simmons going to be the same kind of player that he was in Philadelphia, or better or worse? And is James Harden going to get back to being all NBA caliber James Harden in Philadelphia? Are they going to be able to figure out that fit between him and Joel Embiid? All those things are things we don't know now, so it's pretty difficult to grade definitively. Having said that, because I do think it's such a win-win for both teams, where Brooklyn gets shooting, big depth, they get versatility in the front court with Simmons, they get these future assets, and of course Philly gets their guy in James Harden. I'm going to give each of these teams today, I think it's a classic win-win right now. We move on now to a trade that I have not talked about at all yet on this channel because it happened right after the Harden trade, and that is Kristaps Porzingis going to Washington in exchange for Davis Bertans and Spencer Dinwiddie. We'll begin with the Wizards here. This was a strange move at the time when I saw that they were trading Dinwiddie to Dallas. Kristaps Porzingis was not a player that I thought was going to be involved. It was clear that Dinwiddie was not a good fit on the basketball court in Washington. There were a lot of reports about the fact that the players just didn't like having him there. Just wasn't a very good fit. And I thought, okay, Dallas is going out and getting a guard as Jalen Brunson insurance, as another guy to play alongside Luka, and Washington is dumping his salary essentially. But the fact that they got back Kristaps Porzingis in exchange for Dinwiddie and Bertans is incredibly interesting. But I'm going to give Washington a B- for this deal, and here's why. They take 2 contracts that, yes, were significant in Bertans and Dinwiddie. They add up to be basically the same that KP is making, but KP is making that money an extra year longer than those 2 guys, which is why Dallas made the move, as we'll talk about in a second. And if Bradley Beal leaves this team, this KP contract is even more of a disaster. When he's healthy and he's on the floor, he's a very good player, and he's the best player in the deal when he's healthy. The problem is availability. It's been an issue for Kristaps Porzingis since he came to Dallas, going back to some lower leg injury issues that he had in his time with New York. And if he's just not on the floor for half their games, this is a huge loss for them in terms of the contract they're paying him. And it's weird because it goes a bit against this model they've put together around Bradley Beal of flexibility. Ever since they made the Russ trade, it was all about having contract flexibility, having these future assets, being able to move some things around and sign players in free agency. And the KP contract does not make any of that easier. The only positive spin I can put on this is if they do have some kind of magic recipe to make sure that KP is going to be healthy, and then him alongside Bradley Beal is a really interesting and a fun combination, assuming that Beal re-signs. But there's just so much up in the air here that I would have rather they made a different move than bringing in KP. Now, that's not to say that this is necessarily a huge win for Dallas. I gave them a B for this trade. Getting out of KP's money is a huge win for them. It only gets them out of it an extra year early, but it really starts the clock on free agency going into 2023 for Dallas, because they're going to have guys on expirings like Dinwiddie, like Bertans, and on the court, both those guys are going to help. They're probably going to be more available than KP was. Bertans has been buried in Washington, but assuming that he can find his shooting stroke again, he can be someone that can be very helpful for the spacing there in Dallas. And then Dinwiddie gives them a perimeter creator, someone that can play on or off the ball alongside Luka, has good size, and again, is Jalen Brunson insurance. If he wants to leave as a free agent, or if they need to move him in a sign and trade, it's not the end of the world, because they do still have some perimeter creation in the form of Spencer Dinwiddie. And now they've just opened everything up. They've got all this space around Luka. They're going to play one big at a time, and they no longer have to deal with the massive contract to KP. But my big issue here for them is they were playing really well. They were doing a lot of good things. It felt like they'd figured out the rotation, figured out their roster, and then they have this massive shakeup to their group. Now, granted, as I said, KP's availability was a huge question mark for them, and maybe this provides them some clarity on that. But that's really why it's not better than a B, is because they are saving some contract stuff, but not in an immediate sense. And I just felt like they were playing well. Next up, we'll talk about the CJ McCollum trade, in which New Orleans acquired CJ in exchange for some young players and a future pick. We'll start with the Pelicans. I'm going to give them a C grade for this trade. We talked about this in a previous video. this just is, I just don't like how this move feels. It feels like a win now move for a team that's not in a position to win now. They're double-digit games under 500. They're going to push for the play-in spot. And if Zion doesn't return, there's a real possibility that they don't even make the play-in or they don't even make the playoffs this season. I know that there are other teams in that 9 and 10 slot that are tanking or maybe after the deadline don't have as good of a team. But even if they get the 10 slot, that doesn't mean they're going to make the actual playoffs. And they gave up their first round pick this season in this deal. I'm never going to like a move in which a team is this far under 500, has this many question marks around their roster, and gives up their first round pick in that same season. CJ McCollum is going to help them. He provides them perimeter creation. He provides them a legitimate veteran player that everybody knows is very good, but he's aging. He's on a huge contract. And if Zion doesn't come back, there's no guarantee that this win now move really helps them. So I'm going to give them a C. For Portland, I really like this move for them. I'm going to give them a B+. I think if they had traded McCollum earlier, maybe last year, this grade would be even better for me. That's really the only negative, is that they waited so long. But I think Josh Hart is going to be helpful for their team. This pick could be really, really good for them. And the contract savings here are immense. They already moved on from a Nickeil Alexander-Walker. They get a second or 2 seconds in exchange for him. So the context of the trade is a little bit different now than it was at the time that they made it. But just having the flexibility they now have to build something around Damian Lillard, it's honestly incredible what they did at the deadline. If their goal was to just create space, have more flexible pieces around Dame, and look to acquire guys in free agency and future trades, if that was their goal going into the deadline, it took them a lot of moves to do it, but I think they did an awesome job. And depending on where this pick lands, that could be a valuable asset as well, to the point where Portland is suddenly very, very interesting in free agency and in the trade market this upcoming offseason as they try and build around Dame. And hopefully he decides to stay, at least for their sake, because if he leaves, then their roster is absolutely going nowhere. Next up, probably the most underrated or most overlooked move of the whole deadline, in my opinion, and that's the Boston Celtics acquiring Derek White in exchange for Josh Richardson, Romeo Langford, and their first round pick in 2022. I'm going to begin with Boston. I gave them a C for this deal. I understand why they did it from a roster perspective. They needed another guard alongside Marcus Smart. When you look at what their lineup combinations could be, where it's White, Smart, the 2 wings, and a big, that all looks really, really nice. It's certainly going to help them this season. They've been playing a really short rotation lately. They've managed to move their roster around, where they got rid of Schroeder, they brought in Tice, they bring in Derek White, and now it's very, very clear who their best 8 or 9 guys are, and their starting lineup is certainly better. Here's my issue for Boston. I just don't like the draft compensation in exchange. I don't really care about getting rid of Langford. Josh Richardson was fine for them, but it's the first round pick. I don't see Boston as a real contender this season. I know they've been playing better lately, and I know Derek White helps them this year as well as moving forward because he's signed long term. I would just rather have the pick. I don't think Derek White is a guy you should be trading a first round pick for, and his fit is a little bit questionable in terms of his ability to space off the ball, which is something that Boston certainly needs. They're going to be a very good defensive team, and maybe that'll be enough to really propel them towards the top of the Eastern Conference. But in a conference that's so deep already, and I already didn't view them as near the top of it, I don't love the idea of giving up a pick top 4 protected for this upcoming draft. But for San Antonio, you can tell by the thumbnail, this is an A+ move for them. I thought it was an A+ deadline for them to be able to get a first round pick out of Derek White, given the fact that you already have so many guards. Maybe you can turn Romeo Langford into something. You desperately needed wings. You bring one in Langford, and everybody knows you want to get rid of somebody. You obviously want to keep DeJounte Murray, but you've got Lonnie Walker, you've got Derek White, you've got Josh Primo. Everybody knows you want to get rid of one of these guards. I think that's really good value. And the reason this is also an A+ is when you combine it with what San Antonio did with the rest of the deadline as well. Maybe the most underrated move of the entire deadline was them flipping Thad Young for Goran Dragic and the ability to move up in the draft. Essentially, they flipped Detroit's second round pick, which they had, which is going to fall somewhere in the 30 to 33 range, in exchange for Toronto's first round pick, lottery protected in 2022, which could land anywhere in the 18 to 25 range. They've got 3 first round picks in the 2022 class. This was a fantastic deadline for them. I think it's been an A+ deadline for San Antonio. They did a fantastic job. And then last up, we have the Domantas Sabonis trade. I made a full-length video about this one as well. If you watch that one, you probably know where I'm landing with this. I gave the Kings an F. I don't think there's any scenario in which you should have traded Tyrese Haliburton in exchange for Domantas Sabonis. I know that he's been playing well for Sacramento since arriving. He's certainly going to help them in terms of their frontcourt creation, their passing. He fits relatively nicely alongside this like fast-paced style they're attempting to adopt with him there. Him and De'Aaron Fox are going to be a really fun combination. Maybe they make the playoffs this year, and I think ultimately that was their goal of the deadline, was to put together a group that had a real chance to make the postseason. But when you think about the long-term asset that was Tyrese Haliburton, the amount of team control you had him under, you were going to have Tyrese Haliburton for worst case the first 7 years of his career. And there's all these advanced stats that say that he's one of the bright up-and-coming perimeter creators, defenders, shooters, all that stuff. He's continuing to grow. I just don't think that's a trade you should make in any scenario. I don't think there's any other team in the league that would have made this move other than Sacramento. And of course, for Indiana, I'm going to give them an A+ because it's absolutely a move that is going to pay huge dividends for them moving forward. They did really well at the deadline as well. They get a future first for Karis LeVert. They get Tyrese Haliburton to add. They made some other moves as well. And I just think that it's such a great return in exchange for Sabonis. I'd be interested to know what the other trade packages they were offered in exchange for Sabonis were, but I'm very confident that getting Tyrese Haliburton was better than anything else that they were offered. He's going to be a huge positive asset for them moving forward. I love what they did with this deal. Let me know your own grades for this deadline down in the comment section below. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.